everyone. I am Dr. Lena Green, the Executive Director of the Hope Center, and I am delighted to have you join us today for our first Pride Month event entitled Hope, Healing, and Love. Before I turn you over to our host for today, Ricky Day, I would like to share some very special announcements with you. First up, I want you to know about the Hope Center's Hope in Action Awards Breakfast that is happening on Friday, June 17th. Julius, tell these people about our awards breakfast.
Hey family, join the Hope Center on Friday, June 17th for their third annual Hope in Action Fundraising and Awards Breakfast. This year's event will be held in person at the beautiful Red Eye Grill, which is located at 890 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. This year's awardees have been amazing champions in mental health awareness. Awardees include Sean Dove, Dr. Torian Easterling, and FCBC's very own Dorian Hollingsworth Jr. This year's keynote speaker is Dr. Michael Lindsay, the incoming dean at NYU Silver School of Social Work. This year's hosts are Pastor Mike, Dr. Lena Green, and Dr. Sydney Hangerson. You don't want to miss this. Tickets are currently available and begin at $75. Visit www.hopecenterharlem.org for more information and to get your tickets now.
Thank you, Julius, for letting our folks know about how to get in touch with the Hope Center Hope in Action Awards Breakfast. I encourage you to buy your tickets today. You can visit us and get the link at hopecenterharlem.org on our website. Again, that website address is hopecenterharlem.org. The tickets are affordable. We look forward to celebrating our Hope Center mental health champions, and we look forward to seeing you there. Now that you've heard about our breakfast, tune in to hear more about our Hope Center announcements.
Hey family! Welcome to Healing Conversations, brought to you by the Hope Center, where healing takes center stage. I am Julius J.U. Jones, and yes, these are your Hope Center Harlem announcements. Happy Pride Month, Hope Center family. Exclaim to the world that healing is the new black while reminding yourself that you are authentic and worthy of love, happiness, joy, respect, and healing. Head over to shop.fcbcnyc.org to take a peek at Hope Center Pride merch. Free shipping on orders of $50 or more, international shipping excluded. The Hope Center continues to guide us on our journey of healing on purpose and evolving by minimizing the stigma around communities of color seeking mental health services. Be sure to check out upcoming June programming, including Think It, Say It, Do It, a digital Hope Center motivational series in partnership with author J.R. McDonald, is here to remind us to laugh, dance, and use transformational words to catapult us to new dimensions. Are you ready to join the Think It, Say It, Do It movement? Tap into the Hope Center's Instagram on Friday, June 10th at 12 p.m. noon to change your words and change your life. The Hope Center has partnered with First Candle, Northern Manhattan Parental Partnerships, and Ryan Wolf Kosar to bring you Let's Talk, Infant Safe Sleep pop-up event on Tuesday, June 21st from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. This in-person event will take place at the Hope Center, which is located at 228C West 116th Street. Stop by to learn about preventative measures of SIDS, also known as sudden infant death syndrome. Light refreshments, baby gear, and other giveaways are available while supplies last. Brothers, this one is just for you. The Hope Center is hosting the second edition of In the Den on Thursday, June 30th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. at a Harlem location. Men, come out, fellowship, and have empowering conversations. Hosted by Pastor Mike of FCBC, this is an event you don't want to miss. Registration is a must as space is limited. Visit www.hopecenterharlem.org to register. Well, that's it for now, Hope Center family. Remember to follow and stay in the know with all things Hope Center on social media. Whether you tap in via Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, the key is to continue to heal on purpose and evolve. The Hope Center's crisis text line is still free, 24/7 and confidential. If you ever need someone to talk to about life's multitude of moments, text WORTHY to 741-741. That's WORTHY to 741-741. Also, support Hope Center Harlem programming and mission through 2 easy ways to give. Whether you text to give or give via Hope Center's website, all donations support the work of the Hope Center and are tax deductible. I am Julius J.U. Jones, and these were your Hope Center Harlem announcements. Now back to you, Dr. Green.
Thank you so much for those announcements, Julius. Now, it is my esteemed pleasure to turn you over and introduce our host for tonight's healing conversation, Ricky Day. Ricky Day is a Harlem, New York-based interdisciplinary visual artist, photographer, and filmmaker, working primarily with themes related to identity, pop culture, and the African American experience. He lives and works right here in Harlem, New York, and has exhibited his works in numerous groups and solo exhibitions across the globe, including exhibitions right here in New York City, Los Angeles, DC, and Switzerland. His photography has appeared in numerous publications, including GQ Magazine, Blue Magazine, and the New York Post, to name a few. Ricky's commercial clients, past and present, include Google, YouTube, Native Son, Nivea, and Interscope Records. Ricky's recent and current media projects merge his faith and theological education with his creative talents. He is the host of the popular and uplifting podcast, Nothing to Lose But Yourself. Shout out to Ricky because I was just on his podcast most recently. In 2019, he wrote and directed the theological short film, Reflections, a visual essay about what it means to be a Christian. Ricky is a trained minister, having received his certificate in Christian ministry and leadership from none other than NYTS, New York Theological Seminary, in June of 2021. Ricky has been accepted into the Master of Divinity program at NYTS, where he intends to continue his studies. Please give it up right now for our host extraordinaire, joining us right after the sound of my voice. Welcome, Ricky Day.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Hello, everybody. Good evening to you. Welcome to Healing Conversations here for the Hope Center. We are looking forward to a dynamic conversation. Happy Thursday to you and happy Pride Month to you. It is Pride 2022, and this conversation centers around pride and Black gay male identity through the lens of hope, healing, and love. Before we get started, though, I want you guys to come on in and let us know that you're here in the room in the comment section. Why don't you tell us what hope means to you personally and where you're shouting from? Let's start with that and get ourselves set up and ready to go in this conversation. While you guys chime in and tell us a little bit about what hope means to you and where you're from, let's start with these introductions of our wonderful guests for the evening, if we can do that. First of all, our first guest is Emil Wilbekin, our first panelist. Emil is a multimedia maverick. He contributes to Architectural Digest and Town and Country. He's the co-producer and writer on the documentary film The Remix, Hip Hop and Fashion, which is on Netflix. Emil also does public speaking centered on conversations around culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, and LGBTQ plus issues. He is also, of course, the founder of Native Son, a platform created to inspire and empower Black gay and queer men. Previously, of course, Emil is a media maverick. He served as a chief content officer at Afropunk, editor-in-large at Essence, managing editor of Essence.com, editor-in-chief of Giant and Vibe, magazines. And under his leadership at Vibe won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence in 2002. Emil, of course, holds a BS in Mass Media Arts from Hampton University and an MS in Journalism from Columbia University. He, of course, resides here in New York. Emil Wilbekin, welcome. How are you, sir?
Thank you. Thank you, Ricky, for having me. Thank you, Dr. Green.
Good to see you. Our second panelist is no stranger to FCBC and to Harlem. He is Dr. Hugh Love. Dr. Love is a licensed clinical psychologist at the Uptown Hub program in New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Wow, that's a mouthful. He holds an appointment as well as assistant clinical professor of medical psychology in psychiatry at the Columbia University Gallegos College of Physicians and Surgeons. At the Uptown Hub, Dr. Love provides behavioral health services to youth and young adult clients ages 14 to 24 in a grant-funded community-based program. Dr. Love received his doctorate in school psychology from Fordham University in New York, and he holds a master's degree in counseling from New York University and a bachelor's degree in business from Morehouse College. Dr. Love previously worked as a forensic evaluator at the NYC Family Court, where he primarily evaluated juvenile delinquency and child neglect abuse cases. Dr. Love specializes in the treatment of emerging adults and men and boys of color with specific interests in the role of masculinity and gender roles play in the mental health and well-being of this population. He has special training also in psychological and neuropsychological testing, and he maintains a small private practice focusing primarily on assessment and serves as an adjunct professor for several universities. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Hugh Love. Hey, how are you?
Good evening. I'm doing great.
I've known you for years, and I didn't realize how decorated you are. My goodness. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Love. And last but certainly not least is Brandon Swaby. Brandon is an educator and administrator born and raised in Bronx, New York. Brandon has advocated for equity, for educational equity for social, cultural, and linguistically diverse students in the Bronx, Harlem, and Central New Jersey, as well as Central Delaware for the past 12 years. Believing that the education and liberation of young minds and liberation of society as a whole are bound as one, Brandon seeks to build bridges and engage diverse groups of people in meaningful dialogue, supporting positive outcomes for the students and communities that he serves. Brandon feels called to engage in this soul work of creating positive outcomes and quality education for young minds while providing support for their parents as well. Brandon earned his BA in psychology at William Patterson University of New Jersey and his MAT at Relay GSE. Welcome to the panel and the discussion, Brandon Swaby. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you. And thank you so much for educating our young people. Well, we want to dive in, but I think it's important. First of all, how's everybody doing? Everybody doing well?
Well.
It's Pride Month. Happy Pride to you. I see Sharon Harrison saying hello, FCBC. And we'll be looking at some of the comments as they pop up a little bit during this conversation and hear more about people's thoughts about what hope means to them. There's some statistics that we want to share at the top of this, just to give us some context for which we're having this conversation. This is a panel of Black gay men, and being a member of the LGBTQI plus community in this country has always been challenging and quite often even a dangerous experience, right? And as for most things American, being Black makes it that much more complicated and difficult. We, of course, are all aware that we are living in the midst of a global pandemic. Yes, I said living because that's not over, despite what everybody seems to be thinking and acting like. But we also are existing in a time of increased racial, social, and political upheaval. And if we didn't have enough, now we got severe inflation to deal with. So it's complicated for so many of us as Americans and as African Americans. But at the same time, in many ways, we're living in a time of tremendous contributions to our society and achievements by members of the Black LGBTQI community, demonstrated by the success of recording artist Lil Nas X, writer-producer Lena Waithe, actress Laverne Cox, who now has a Barbie doll in her image. You got hit TV shows like Legendary and Pose, which have audiences that transcend gender and transcend the gay LGBT community. I mean, they're really popular shows across the board with wide audiences. And of course, we've got the 11 7-time Tony-nominated show Strange Loop on Broadway, which was written by Michael R. Brown, who identifies as a Black gay man. So in many ways, it's the best of times and the worst of times. But to touch on some statistics that'll give us some context of what we're living through in terms of the economy and the community that we're living in, 33% of Black LGBTQ individuals reported experiencing discrimination in the last year. That's on top of being Black and dealing with the things that we deal with as LGBTQ people. There's an increased level of difficulty that we live in. Same thing happens in the economic space. There's some economic statistics that we were reading through as we were preparing for this conversation. They're dire as well. As difficult as the times are for the mass of the society, they're even more difficult for us. And so when you think about the context in which we are living, my first question is a direct and very personal one to each and every one of you. How has the pandemic and the political and social events of the last couple of years affected you personally and your loved ones and extended community in terms of not only your mental health, but your physical well-being and in many ways your spiritual health as well? Let's start with Emil.
Well, thank you, Ricky. That is a question that I live with every single day in my own life, in my own head, in my own body, and also with the community that I've served of Native Son. You know, I can't separate COVID and the pandemic along with what happened to George Floyd, because those two really, really connected from being in deep isolation um, and going through all this fear of the unknown, right? Will we make it through this? Were we all going to survive? To seeing George Floyd so brutally murdered on television by a law officer. And so I think that as we live in our Black bodies as queer folks, we live at the intersection of both. And so how do we separate those things? So we're already living in this really traumatic time of COVID, right? And everything, and having to wear masks and wash our hands and get vaccinated and all those things, housing insecurities, food insecurities, job insecurities, all these things that our community's living with. And then also having to deal with the threat of police violence in the state. So it's tough, right? And so how has that affected me and my family and my friends? It affects me daily, right? It affects me like those statistics. You know, do people see me as a Black man first or as a gay man? And so we kind of live in that duality throughout the world. So mental health has definitely been a strain. You know, I was laid off from my job in the beginning of the pandemic. Did not have health insurance through most of the quarantine. And so that affected me deeply because fortunately I had a therapist who treated me free of charge, but I had to work through my fear of getting sick and not being able to take care of myself with the fear, of not being able to maybe pay my rent or buy groceries and just kind of all these different traumas that I was living through. And it was very, very tough. And I'm just grateful for obviously my faith. I became deeper in my faith during that time, but I'm also grateful for my network of friends and family and the community of Native Son that I could kind of lean into. And obviously the graciousness of my therapist.
Very, very good. Brandon, same question to you. And personally, as well as you being an educator, I'm interested in what you've experienced your students are dealing with as well as a result of what we've been living through.
It's a very interesting question. I would echo a lot of what Emil said for starters, right? Like all the different things happening in the pandemic, the impacts on people's career, people's family members' health, all those things. I think it increases a lot of paranoia, right? And if speaking for myself, mental health, it really forced me it was an opportunity to slow down, I'll say, right? Really look in the mirror and really come face to face with things that were in my life not really working anymore, things that I was before the pandemic. I could ignore because I was so busy, right? Just moving around, teaching, trying to keep up with the social life. That you can always have three things in life, right? Social life, your studies or your career, and sleep. And so I was definitely doing a lot of social life, keeping up with my career, not sleeping as much, but with the pandemic and forcing me to slow down, I had a chance to really look in the mirror. And so I realized I was able to see the cracks in my relationships, platonic and romantic, right? Think about the areas I wanted to grow, and really sit back and make a game plan about how I wanted to like move forward and be better during that time. But also, I think it's hard because you're so isolated. And so, in that isolation, you're still dealing with loneliness, and it's just an added layer of trauma, not being able to connect. We're social beings. And so, I think those are a lot of that encompasses a lot of what I experienced during the pandemic personally. When I think about my students, I think about there were students who thrived during the pandemic with remote learning because they had a chance to be independent and they got free of people's expectations or whatever the story is that people had painted of them. I think often, depending how you present, especially if you're a student of color, especially if you're a male, especially if you are not the student who comes in the room, sits down, folds your hands, and is ready to learn, you are painted as a problem, as maybe having some sort of educational disability. And that creates like the expectations people have of you starts to present in your behavior. Right. And so I think that ultimately some kids are able to get free of that and really do better. On the other hand, students who I would say needed that support, that in-person connection, and really thrive in school, that's where they experience some struggle, some learning loss. And so I think the pandemic impacted kids very differently. It was a wide variety of skill that was shown throughout this course of remote learning, right? But ultimately, I can't say that coming back from it and now being back in schools that as a whole our kids thrived, because even the kids who are home and able to pass their classes, you're picking up other habits, right? And kids who maybe weren't into alcohol and drugs became exposed to it during that pandemic with all that extra time. And just other habits that they may have picked up. And so ultimately, I don't know if the time to slow down impacted everybody. Everybody was able to benefit from it. But yeah, that would be my experience thus far.
Before I go to Dr. Love, I have a follow-up for you. Has, the pandemic and the experience that you and your students have lived through, has that transformed in any meaningful way the relationship that you've had with the parents themselves?
Definitely so. I think that it allows, it's allowed for more connection and understanding. I think throughout the pandemic, remote learning, schools in general, the business of schools was able to slow down and really appreciate people on a human level. And so I think because that time we were able to really just connect as humans and not so much the business of school of, hey, guess what? Your student did not follow this rule today. This is going to be the impact, the consequence. Or, hey, guess what? Your kid is this model student and here's the pressure, and now they have to keep it up, right? And they have to pass these tests. Because we were able to get away from that and really appreciate people as humans, I think now coming back into the building, being back in schools, we were able to bring some of that back with us. And now there is more wiggle room to really work with one another on an individual case-by-case basis and honor each other's humanity, instead of this is the system, this is the protocol, we have to follow this, everything is black and white.
Well, that's good. So it sounds like you've gone from these purely transactional relationships to something that's more of a transformative relationship where you're starting to see and interact with each other's humanity and use that as the bridge to do what you need to do for the students. Dr. Love, I'm very curious about your response, both personally and then how it's affected you and your profession, because you guys are more in demand than probably anybody right now, other than maybe doctors and nurses. So let's hear a little bit about your experience in the early stages of not only the pandemic, but this racial and social and political upheaval that we're living through.
Sure. So I'll first say I was blessed that my family was okay. I think many of their statuses as essential workers, nurses, working for supermarkets, things of that nature, kept them employed. So that was a blessing in and of itself. And I know factually that wasn't the case for a lot of people. When I look at myself and how it impacted me, I just remember it always takes me back to the very early days of the pandemic where I had a thermometer and I took my temperature at least 7 times a day just to make sure I didn't have COVID, just expecting it to read fever and then to freak out. So it raised my own anxiety. It forces you to look at your own mortality. it forced me to reevaluate everything that I thought was a given. Like the given of walking outside freely without a mask, the given of being able to access my social supports easily. So I had to that was a reevaluation there. And then you take it to the professional. I never thought leaving graduate school that I would have ever worked from home. It wasn't in my purview. It wasn't something I thought of. But on May 16th, they sent me home and we went 100% virtual. Luckily, we had the systems in place to be able to do that. But at that point, we were just like, and, adjusting to a new modality of doing things when you've been doing things the same way every time. I go to the waiting room, I pick up my patient, they come to my office, we sit down and we look at each other. With some variation. And now we're logging on to computer screens or we're doing phone sessions. And we had to pivot and we had to evolve. We had to figure out how to give services to those that we knew were in distress. But interestingly enough, that we were also in distress. Like the pandemic presents that unique context where I'm going through not exactly, but I'm going through in many ways the same trauma that everyone else is going through. Mm-hmm. I'm locked in. I can't go anywhere. I can't see my family. I can't see my friends. And so it is that kind of shared human experience that, one helps to raise your empathy, but also, forces you into that experience and helps you to sit in someone else's shoes. But then for me, I think the political social, even though I agree with Emil that you can't unlink that from how isolation magnified that. Mm-hmm. But that I found that more stressful. And I think I found that more stressful because it's hard to be an empathic person and be surrounded by pain all the time. Whether that be the pain of illness, whether that be the pain of watching a senseless murder played on loop on your television screen. And it's hard to hear hateful rhetoric coming from every direction. Your TV screen, your radio, your newspapers, what have you. But like everything, I had to sit with it. And I had to adjust to it. Just like I had to adjust to virtual therapy, I had to adjust and find some degree of peace in order to be able to function, to be able to have sanity, to be able to service the population that I serve. And also to be able to sit with knowing I was in a privileged position and a lot of people weren't. I was able to work while I knew many of my patients and families were not able to. So being able to sit with that and find some peace in the midst of that chaos was difficult, but I did. And I continue to do it because it's a process.
You mentioned privilege, and I want to pivot on that because that's an important word and concept, and it leads into the next question. The four of us, and we're having this conversation, by the way, tonight. I want to be clear with everyone. We're having a conversation tonight in the context of Black gay men from multiple generations, right? But the LGBTQ community, of course, is made up of a far more diverse group. There's our transgender brothers and sisters, there's intersex folks, there's bisexual folks, there's an entire community umbrella out there that we sit as part of. And of course, we all sit as part of the larger African-American community. You mentioned privilege, and as a fairly masculine, cisgendered, male presenting group of guys, there's a certain amount of privilege that we walk in. But also, when you look at the pandemic has affected the country and the world in a certain way. Then it affected African Americans more severely. And then as Black LGBTQ folks, we got affected even more severely. I'm very curious about, and whoever wants to take this, so you're welcome to take it. Have you witnessed the effects of the pandemic and the social and criminal justice reckoning that we're living in? Have you really looked at and noticed exponentially different kind of effect on the Black, gay, lesbian, transgender, intersex community? And I'm very interested in your response to that because, we've seen an uptick in trans violence and there's kinds of things going on. How has the community responded to this? How have you seen this to affect the community as you guys have sat in it and as individuals? Emil?
You said anybody could jump in. I'm trying not to jump in all the time. Okay. So, I think a very mixed bag as you were talking and listing all the different kind of um, possibilities, right? So, from a Native Son perspective, right, we saw Black, gay, and queer men thrive um, from a artistic and professional lens, right? In
Mhm.
2020, Michael R. Jackson and, of course, I'm blanking on my brother's name, the poet, both won the Pulitzer Prize that year. We saw these really great strides with Black folks, right? We saw Billy Porter, do great things. We saw all these different corporate leaders rise in power because they were Black gay men. And so when George Floyd happened and corporations were looking, right, for um, Black folks to fill these positions, fortunately for us, we saw Don Lemon rise, right? On CNN. We saw Jonathan Capehart get his own show on MSNBC. So we saw that part. The other part that we also saw was those suicide rates go up exponentially, particularly with young Black teens and particularly with Black boys. I don't know the stats on Black boys who are considered men who have sex with men or gay or queer, but we do know that there is a segment of that community that is larger. We saw more drug use, we saw more unemployment, and more crime, right? So these
Mhm.
are all things that affected our community kind of across the board. And then you think about the really vicious murders of Black trans women. Um, but for some reason, and I don't know if this is our queerness, I feel like I saw more Black queer folks kind of pushing forward, right? Like using their resilience at a time where a lot of people were broken, they actually chose to thrive and rise up and use their voice. But if you look back historically, that's what has happened, right? If you look at the Marsha P. Johnson, you look at the Harlem Renaissance, and you look at James Baldwin and Lorraine Hainsbury, like we've seen where when we are in struggle, Bayard Rustin, we push forward as a Black queer community. So those are some of the things that I saw. It was very mixed, very high, very low, and very in between.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's profound and it's accurate. And I've witnessed it in my own life. And I've been blessed enough to, as Brandon mentioned, to sit in a certain amount of privilege to be able to work from home. And as a result, I was able to thrive. But so many have not. Dr. Love, you're a therapist and you talk to folks like myself all the time dealing with the mental the results of the things that we experience in our life, the traumas from childhood, the events of current day, those kinds of things. And I think the mental toll on us is pretty well documented. But I'm curious for you and the rest of the panelists, how have you seen some of the stress and the mental challenges that you've experienced? Have they shown up in your body? And how have you seen them manifest in your body? I ask that because I think as African Americans, we live with a certain amount of stressors on a regular basis, and we just take them for granted as part of the culture, as part of our existence. But they lead to a lot of the comorbidities that we all face. And so I'm curious for each of you, as young, relatively healthy men, a relatively young and healthy men, have you seen that stress manifest in your body? Have you seen your body start to show what you've been living through? Let's start with you, Dr. Love.
Absolutely. My position as a therapist doesn't make me immune to anxiety, and my anxiety lives right here. When I'm anxious, when I'm stressed, it shows up in my shoulders. I can feel it because there is a mind-body connection. Our body and our mind are inextricably linked, and so if the mind is in distress, oftentimes so is the body. And some of us show it more than others physically, and maybe some of us show it less, but it's there. And whether that be more up front and center with some of the things that I said with muscle tension and things like that, or pull out that blood pressure monitor and strap that cuff on and see what your blood pressure is doing right now. And we know very well that Black men, gay, straight, or otherwise, are already, living on the cusp with hypertension. And so that didn't help anybody. So it has definitely shown up in my body and it continues to show up in my body. And you continue to have to cope with that and try to deal with, kind of those manifest symptoms.
Mm. Brandon, what about you? Is it shown up in your body? You're the youngest of the four of us, but I'm curious, have you seen the effects show up for you as well, sir?
I would echo those same sentiments about anxiety. I think that just overall across the country, I think anxiety has risen throughout the pandemic. I think that we've all become so hyper aware of like safety, cleanliness, right, and making sure that we are protecting ourselves against these viruses that are out here, right? Um, that has also caused a little bit of stress and anxiety and concerned about, hey, where am I at, who am I interacting with, have these people been around other folks, right? And even, it's crazy to imagine, but I even have students who have come back to school and have had so much anxiety that they can't make it through one class period, right? They're just anxious, they don't want to catch COVID. They've had family members that unfortunately they've seen their families impacted by the pandemic, right? And so I think it just has increased overall awareness and anxiety, no matter how old you are.
Yeah. And Emil, we talk almost daily, so I know you've had some effects. Would you like to share or add any more to this piece of it?
Sure. I mean, the same as the rest of the panel, like anxiety and things like that for sure, and having to take medication now to kind of manage that. And then also ended up with hypertension, so I have to take medication to manage that. And then the big thing for me was I gained a lot of weight. And so that weight, was being in the house and just kind of not exercising as much. I also went into the pandemic with an injury to my hip, or what I thought was an injury, which I've later found out was arthritis, and it got worse because of sitting so much. Was I usually am sitting here working, and not exercising, going out. So I've had to work through a lot of that, and it's almost like starting from ground zero. It's like weight loss, eat healthy, sleep more, taking naps throughout the day if I'm stressed, pausing to meditate and pray, a lot of different things like that.
Mm. As a community, we deal with a lot: homophobia, transphobia, violence against us, and even the things that you survive quite often leave a wound, right? And so many of us just pick up the pieces, and as Emil pointed out earlier, we just find ways to thrive and to move forward. But if you don't heal wounds, they still stay with you. They show up in other ways. I am curious, Brandon. I'd like to start with you. Is there something that wounded you that you'd like to share with us, and how did that wound kind of inhibit your access to joy, and what have you done to seek healing from that? Because I think it's important for people to understand that so many of us are walking with these wounds, but you just can't put them away. You've got to confront them, you got to heal them, because they're blocking you from things that you may not even realize they're blocking you from. And then how do you find help to heal? So Brandon, what is something that may have wounded you, and how did it inhibit your access to joy, and what have you done to heal or seek healing in the current times?
The first thing that comes to mind is this idea of genuine connection. I think the wound would be losing that daily humanistic interaction with other folks. The impact is that when you are kind of like reintegrating into society, right? It's not comfortable. It's not easy to show up as your full self, your authentic self around other people, to then be trusting. Because in some ways, I think I got really comfortable being by myself during the pandemic, right? And so how do you now go out and forge new relationships and revive some of those older relationships that didn't last throughout those early months in the pandemic? Because, hey, we're not going out to party anymore. We're not going out to be social. And so how do you pick back up? What does that look like? And so for myself, I think it's been giving myself grace, right? I may not want to do all the same things that I did find joy in before, but allowing myself some time and some space and time to really take my time to get back into some of those things. Also seeking out mental health support, right? To see like, hey, why am I not trusting people as much anymore? What can I do about that? Is this like a normal response, or do I need to work through something? And so I think that is the wound for me, and some of what I'm still trying to work through, right? Because it's not an overnight solution.
Not at all. It's a process. Absolutely. Dr. Love, what about you?
Oh, absolutely. I'll say this because I'll be non-specific because it's a wound that I'm still working on, but I always title it losing myself. So when I think about my life, I always think about three very large traumas: losing my father when I was 17, losing my mother when I was 34, and losing myself in my early 30s. And I call it a trauma because it was an event that occurred that was so unexpected that it forced me into a place of questioning who I was, or what I stood for up to that point. And it caused me to deny myself a lot of access to things, whether that be new relationships, whether that be romantic or platonic, access to healing spaces, lots of guilt, lots of shame, lots of things. And it's something that I continue to work on today, but it started with acceptance and finding kind of the me that was still there, for lack of better phrasing. But it was trying to look in the mirror and know that I'm still a good person. I still have something to offer. I still have value, and that no circumstance or situation took that away from me. And I had to accept that, and I had to, again, sit with it. Had to pray on it a lot. Had to eventually seek some support for that as well. So, it was a combination of things. But yeah, I had to find my way out of that.
Emil, do you have something that you'd like to share?
Sure, I'll be brief. Just mentioning that I was laid off from my job at the beginning of the pandemic, it was coming out of a not great situation, work situation, and an unhealthy situation, and then going straight into the pandemic. And so I think, it was really tricky because I didn't really have a chance to heal because I left one kind of dark situation and entered another one. And I think that's been a lot of the work that I've had to do along the way through quarantine and now coming, out and reentering the world. And I really resonate with what Brandon and Dr. Love said. It's like the isolation part, the trusting part, and then kind of needing to heal and to access different parts of myself. It takes time because we're kind of, still in this pandemic. And so the pressures are still there. We're not fully active again. We're not fully living our own lives. And so it's kind of healing while in this breach. And so that's kind of what I've been working through.
Okay. And I'll share one of the wounds. There are many, but one of the wounds for me is I previously was in a relationship that looked like it was headed towards marriage. It was a wonderful relationship, one that brought me a lot of joy and happiness, and it looked like the one. And then they went away for some time for work and came back, and it was just over. No real explanation, no closure, no nothing. And so there's this sense of abandonment, this deep sense of loss that happens. And it started to inhibit my joy because who wants to feel that again? It's a deep, deep wound when something like that happens. And I'm undercutting it right now because I'm trying to be brief, but it was pretty deep psychic wound. And I realized it was inhibiting my access to joy because it was making me afraid to be open again, afraid to connect not only to an individual of potential relationship, but starting to be afraid to connect to community, which we all know that we need, particularly in times like this. And for me, one of the ways I sought healing and still seek healing is through therapy. And I started to engage in therapy to talk about what that wound was and why I felt the way that I felt about it and why I had the connection to it. And if there were patterns that were present in my life that I didn't realize were there before that led me to making the kind of choices that put me in those situations in the first place. And so I found therapy to be something that's been wonderful for me. It's like having a professional, great friend who can talk to you about things and help you see patterns and help you see things in yourself that you may not see in your own. And, before we leave, I really want to touch on that. There's a stigma in the Black community around seeking therapy and around mental health and awareness. And, we hear at the Hope Center, it's not lost on me that that's really kind of the center of the work they do. And so, Dr. Love, if you could, as we, start to wind down, I know a couple of us here, or it sounds like all of us have engaged in therapy in some form or another. Could you really briefly kind of give people a sense of what therapy looks like and is? Because I think so many people haven't experienced it, have no idea what to expect, and they're afraid of the unexpected and the unknown, right? And I want to help destigmatize this for people.
Yeah, I mean, therapy looks like what's happening right now. Therapy is a conversation. I think the misconception is that you're going to go into therapy, you're going to sit on a couch facing someone like they oftentimes portray on TV, and that someone's going to tell you how to live your life. And that's couldn't be further from the truth, or it should be super far from the truth. So therapy is a conversation. Therapy is a conversation because my job as your therapist is not to tell you what to do. My job is to help you explore the possibilities, um, to explore your blind spots, um, to be able to see from the outside. Because, sometimes we are so close to events in our lives that we don't see all the other parts of it. And so sometimes it takes an outside entity looking onto it and saying, like, hey, have you noticed that every time you bring up this subject, you cringe and you shudder? Or every time I ask you this question, you go on to the next topic. And so, yeah, there can be some challenge in therapy, but again, we also know that there is, the way to your healing oftentimes is through your confrontation with your pain. So you don't get to the other side by, kind of skating around it. You got to go through it. And so my job is to help you walk through it, usually in a conversational tone, sometimes giving you tips, tricks, skills, coping mechanisms to help fill in those gaps. But largely it's a conversation about what's going on in your life, because I'm an expert in psychology. I'm not an expert on you. You're the expert in your life. And so I believe that you have all the answers inside of you. Sometimes you just need somebody to help you point towards the door and, walk a little bit that way and think about it. Have you thought about it this way? So you are the expert. You're the expert in the room. And so any great therapist or any good therapist should be able to allow you to be the expert in the room.
Yeah, and I would add, the same way that, we don't make it through this life with our bodies being completely healthy the entire time, the same thing is true of our mental health. We go through good days and bad days and slight depression and maybe it will be more intense. And then sometimes there's psychological issues. Those things all exist. And you would go to a medical doctor to deal with issues with your body. So you absolutely should go to a psychological or psychiatry professional to deal with issues of your mental health. But in addition to that, therapy does not have to exist in the space of something being quote unquote wrong. Everybody can benefit from therapy. And I think it's important for people to understand it, particularly again, in the times that we live in as people on this planet, as African Americans in this country, and as Black, gay, and lesbian, and transgender folks here. There's a lot that we deal with daily, and it's important to talk to somebody about it and unpack and heal those wounds. Brandon or Emil, is there anything you'd like to share about your experiences in therapy that you both seem to have mentioned that you do? I'm curious about your experiences. Is there anyone you want to share as we start to wind down? Brandon.
So, I mean, overall for myself, I think I know that I know it's impactful for myself because I'll get ready for a session and in my head I'm like, hey, I don't need this. I don't need to go to this one. And by the time I leave, I'm like, oh my gosh, like we just cracked the Da Vinci Code. Let's go. I'm ready for the world now. And so for me, when things are good, when things are bad, I think it is helpful just to have a sounding board, somebody to help process the things with and just be like, hey, I'm not crazy. Because often when we are going through things, we feel like, or at least for myself, right? I feel like I'm the only one going through things. And so it is good to have a neutral party there that can just kind of like give me that little bit of affirmation. Like, hey, no, you're not nuts. I see why you would think that, but hey, have you thought about things from this perspective, right? And on a related note, it's interesting because, once you're in therapy, I think that folks start to see it differently. But before you get into it, when someone mentions it to you, what I've noticed when I mention it to others is like that armor immediately goes up. It's like, nothing's wrong with me. What do you mean therapy? Are you crazy? And that's, I guess for me, I'm still trying to figure out how can I mention to folks like, hey, like it's worth exploring without folks feeling super defensive, because no matter how it seems to be phrased, I still get that reaction. And so for myself, that is something I'm still trying to work through.
Well, you're doing it right now, and I think I think it might be effective. Emil, what about you? Anything you want to share?
I mean, I'll just kind of echo what Brandon said. I think it's like if you consider when you don't go to church, or if you don't practice yoga, or if you don't go work out, and when you do, you feel amazing afterwards. And that to me is what therapy is like. It is just being in that safe space and being able to talk freely and to go in without judgment. And I think that's the best form of therapy, is when you can just be free and not kind of judge yourself, not put shame or stigma on yourself, and just really kind of tap into the possibilities of healing.
Hope, healing, and love. That's what it's about. And for me, those of you who know me or have listened to the podcast, you know that the definition of love that I work from right now was shared with me by Bell Hooks via M. Scott Peck. And that quote is that love is making oneself available for the nurturing of one's own or another's spiritual growth. Love is both an action and an intention. Love is as love does. And so, when you think about it, there's all these tenets of love, right? There's care, there's compassion, there's those things. But at the end of the day, you should be working and moving in such a way that nurtures your own or another's spiritual growth. And that is love. And to find therapy and to find other tactics and tools that can help you be holistically healthy, mind, body, and soul, I think it's one of the most loving things you can do for yourself and for those that you care about. And we're going to wind down, but I wanted to thank all of the panelists for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, too brief, but great nonetheless. And I'd love to, first of all, I'm going to read a comment that came up I want to share, and then I want to get your social media handles so people know where they can find you guys. P. Lasade on FCBC social media said, great conversation. Thanks all for sharing your experiences. You are very welcome. I'd like to piggyback on that to say that, we exist as human beings in this thing called community. And community is this feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And I think communities are clearly important. And it's important for us as individuals to take care of ourselves as we're bringing healthy, whole selves to the communities that we're a part of and extend our experiences to other people so we can help them to heal and not walk around like the walking wounded that so many of us are, and that we can start to build healthy communities by building healthy selves. Brandon, where can people find you on social media if you want them to find you?
You can find me on Twitter at businessman Swaby, 1 S in the word business, and Instagram at Swaby_.
All right. And Dr. Love, what about you on social media or your practice? If these people are interested in being treated, where can they find you?
Well, you'll find me on Instagram at HughPhD. And my business email address is hughphd@gmail. So that's the best way to find me for business reasons.
Got it. And Mr. Wilbekin, what about you?
So it's my name. It's at Emil Wilbekin on all social platforms, and then Native Son is at Native Son Now.
And once again, Native Son is a great organization that Emil founded to recognize Black and queer, gay and queer men. And just so y'all know, in case anybody's confused, people be gay. People be gay. That is the Native Son t-shirt that I probably wasn't supposed to tell you guys it's going to launch soon, but it is launching very soon. And
at Bloomingdale's.com.
Bloomingdales.com. Look at that. Look at God. And the last thing I want to leave us all with, I think people who are here in this conversation for the most part are familiar with FCBC. So I don't have to tell you this. I'm preaching to the choir. But to anybody else outside of the FCBC world who's listening to this, understand this. Dr. Lena Green says this. She's even has a t-shirt that says it, and I agree with it. Prayer and therapy. God gave doctors and others the ability to treat us, to heal us, to be there for us. He gave them gifts to use to serve us. Therapy is yet another one of those gifts. It is not a sin. It is not a disconnect from your spirit or your faith to seek therapy, to have conversations with people that can help you navigate the crazy that is our current society. I'm Ricky Day. Again, the podcast is Nothing to Lose But Yourself. You can find it on all the major podcast platforms. Dr. Lena Green is my guest from last week, and we had a great conversation, an extended conversation about therapy, about these things. And my guest this week in the episode that just dropped today is Ali Shulatan, who plays Carlton Banks on the new Bel Air on Peacock. So listen to the podcast. It's all about being authentically you and learning to love and embrace yourself, and how that helps you to navigate life, helps make this world a little bit better place, and reduces the temptation for you to try to feel better about who you are by diminishing other people. If you embrace yourself and your own humanity, then you can't help but to see the humanity in somebody else's eyes as you gaze upon them. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm grateful for being here. If you have a crisis or you're interested in any kind of therapy help, there's a crisis text line. You can text WORTHY to 741-741. It's open 24/7. It's confidential. If you need someone to talk to, you can text that number today. And then the last piece here is if you are contemplating, God forbid you are, but if you're contemplating suicide, if you feel like you can't take it, please call the suicide prevention line at 800-273-TALK. That's 800-273-8255 or suicidepreventionlifeline.org. You are here and breathing because you have a purpose, because God created you to be here to do something and to be something. You are necessary. You are needed. You are worthy. Whether you know it or not, it's true. And you're not alone. I love you. You guys have a good night. And thank you again for joining us.